Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Williams. I'm Director of Archives and Special Collections at California State University, Dominguez Hills, and welcome to our 5th annual South Bay History Symposium, sponsored by the Compton 125 Historical Society and the Gerth Archives. We've got a pretty good show up here for us today, talking about preservation and landmarks and a variety of other things. And this is our 5th one. We've done 4 recently. This is the 2nd online. And hopefully next year we'll be back in the archives at Dominguez Hills for live presentations, and I hope you'll all be there for that too. I'm going to turn it over to Tony Hicks for some presentation from the Compton 125 Historical Society. And so Tony, take it away.
Thank you, Greg. Morning, everyone. I'm Tony Hicks, Vice President of the Compton 125 Historical Society. We welcome you to this 5th annual History Symposium. We call it the South Bay History Symposium, sponsored by Compton 125 Historical Society and the Gerth Archives and Special Collections Department from Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. I want to thank our board members who are on the line this morning. I want to just let you know that today we're going to have some great speakers talking about the history of the South Bay. Make sure that you go to our site and continue to follow us on Facebook. That would be Compton 125 Project. If you're on Facebook, Compton 125 Project. We're also on Twitter. Twitter, we're 125 Compton. Twitter is 125 Compton. And we again want to thank the partnership with the Gerth Archives at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. And we wish you a good holiday season and enjoy this presentation today. Thank you.
Okay, our first speaker is going to be Deborah Kelso. Gerard, is the screen up there? You got the thing up there, the PowerPoint? But anyways, Debbie is a historic preservationist and architectural historian, presently providing research projects for the Compton 125 Historical Society. She's been a docent and a preservation activist at the LA Conservancy, among other places. This year, she participated in the Conservancy's Neighborhood Outreach Boot Camp training, which focuses on promoting community awareness and notable buildings and places while conducting research and documentation for their future nominations for historic sites. While working as a planning assistant for the City of Los Angeles Office of Historic Resources and Cultural Heritage Commission, she was on the community liaison at St. Philip the Evangelist Episcopal Church. Her team research and interviews led to the LA Historical Cultural Monument designation number 987 of the Parish Hall in 2010, which was designed by Paul Revere Williams. Other works include Caltrans District 7, Los Angeles, research for the Pasadena Arroyo Seco Freeway Project, the Mamie Clayton Library, archival document preservation. She will also become the California African American Museum History Council Projects Committee Chair in January 2022. So Debbie, go for it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. And I'm going to be honest, I'm a little nervous right now. It's the first time I've done a really big PowerPoint in a long time. So please bear with me. I'm going to discuss some topics. And first of all, on the screen, you will see our title, Discovering South Bay Treasures, Capturing and Preserving South Bay Historical Landmarks. What we are attempting to do today is to share with you information about landmarking, different entities, buildings, places that important people have lived, even plant flora and fauna sometimes are eligible to be nominated as important landmarks or important pieces of our history. So I'm going to start with this PowerPoint. And I may need some help with this because it's not moving. Okay, thank you. So I wanted to start off by discussing what are landmarks. And one of the definitions I found was the definition of a landmark is something that is a recognizable or man-made structure or feature that becomes either local or a national symbol. So the type of symbols that we can use to nominate a entity is, it could be something that is natural or geological, such as a landmass, mountains, trees. For instance, here in California, trees that we would nominate as landmarks would be our sequoia trees because of their long life and their significance in our state. Other topics that we use to create landmarks are architectural, that is buildings that are deemed to be prominent or important within our landscape. Oftentimes these buildings have been in a significant type of architecture style, such as here in California. We have quite a few buildings in the mission style and Spanish colonial revival that harken back and reflect our heritage and our the state's beginnings with the Spanish conquistadores, as well as the native people. Also, buildings can be landmarked by cultural reasons, that is, symbols that relate to important people and places. One example here in Southern California is the Watts Towers. That is a cultural landmark because of its location and the person that actually did the work in building the beautiful ironwork that became the Watts Towers. So let's go to our next slide. Okay, this is an example of what we could say is a natural landmark or physical. This is a photograph I took in the Grand Canyon area of Northwest Arizona. It is on a Native American tribe's reservation. They're called the Hualapai. And their people were very active in Northern Arizona and what we now know as the Las Vegas area. So this is some of the deep picture of one of the very deep canyons. So as many of us know, we have the National Park System. The National Park System has preserved many beautiful outcroppings, geological and geographic places to save for posterity. This is why this is so important as one of the topics that we use for landmarking. Can we do the next slide here? Wait a minute. Yeah. Okay, this is an example of an architectural building that would possibly be nominated for historic status. This is a picture of Hollenbeck Junior High School. It is in the Boyle Heights area of East Los Angeles. What's significant about it is it's in the Art Deco style with streamlined modern elements. You can see here the wrought iron gate and also the rounded streamlined modern elements that are very elegant and beautiful. And that's what makes this building significant and worthy of nomination. Next slide, please. This is a cultural topic. Again, this is the Watts Towers, designed by Mr. Simon Rodia, and they're here in the Watts area of Los Angeles. And I forget how many years it took him, but he started out doing it as somewhat of a hobby, and it ended up becoming a labor of love for him, because what he had done is found used objects, that is pieces of glass, pieces of pottery, wrought iron, and he soldered the wrought iron work together and decorated it in various styles, heart shapes, shells, whatever he could find in the neighborhood. Even soft drink bottles, like old 7-Up bottles, Coca-Cola bottles, were used in as decorating. Next slide, please. Okay, why do we preserve landmarks? We often preserve significant places because often if they are demolished or removed, it could create a significant loss to our environment and our communities. Recently, we experienced the loss of Compton High School. Many people in Compton went to school there. It is known for having very famous graduates. One of the graduates was an actress by the name of Polly Bergen. Ms. Bergen was an actress and she was very popular in the 1950s. She was in movies and also on several game shows as a celebrity guest. Also, there is a woman who was referred to as Tokyo Rose. I've been told that she also went to school here. Several well-known athletes. I know there's Robert might be able to speak more on that later on in the presentation. But the building itself was, it was decided that it wasn't historical, but in actuality, by virtue of its architecture style, which we can see here is an example of what we call wartime or modern, WPA modern, works progress, administration modern, built in the late 20s and through the 30s. It's simple, it has some tile work on it. And also there was a campanile or bell tower in the back of this building, the administration building, that was Spanish colonial revival. The school district decided to demolish it because they felt it didn't have any historic significance. Next slide, please. Okay, this is what it looks, part of what the property looked like after the demolition in June of this year. And the district has proposed that they're going to build a new and more modern structure there. Unfortunately, a lot of the historic fabric was gone. The cornerstone, some of the time capsules that the previous students had left, they were all demolished and gone. Next slide, please. So next question is, how do we preserve our historic places? Oftentimes we do advocacy through community groups, such as people that would band together and maybe sign petitions, go to their cities, ask to have a hearing, so to speak, and get public awareness about a particular building or place, even trees that are so significant that they feel they need to be saved for posterity. Historic societies and research documentation. If a building cannot be saved, oftentimes preservationists will use what we call HABs, which is the Historic American Building Survey, and HARE, which is the Historic American Engineering Records. These are both photographic surveys that are used to document what a building looked like, what its uses were before it goes to demolition. That way we have a record of what the building looked like and what its purposes were before it was demolished. Next slide, please. This is, I wanted to show this picture of Bruce's Beach. As many people know, the property was previously owned by an African-American couple, the Bruce family, and their land was taken away from them through the government practice of eminent domain. So they were not given what they felt was the proper amount of money when the land was taken away. However, through strict documentation, research, outreach to the present day relatives of these two individuals, and the city itself being proactive about recognizing the importance of the structures that were on the beach, which happened to be a beach house, and recreation facilities for African Americans to come and enjoy the beach in an area where up to that time, it was okay for them to actually go and get in the water. In other communities that have beachfront properties, they weren't allowed to come and bathe. Also in Santa Monica, they were limited to a section that was called the Inkwell. And so to come to Bruce's Beach was a point of excitement for the community. And when it was demolished, it was a severe loss to the African-American community. So through professional research, advocacy groups, and connections to governmental agencies such as the County of Los Angeles and state government, the family has been able to reclaim their property, and we will see what happens in the future. But however, people have erected this plaque, and it tells the story of the Bruce family and the beach itself. Next slide, please. The latest local designation that I was aware of that just happened this summer was the designation of the Malaga Cove buildings and shopping center in Palos Verdes estate. These buildings are designed in the Spanish colonial revival style. And there is elegant artwork, statues, plasterwork on many of the buildings in this plaza. It has been actively used since the 1920s by the community that surrounds it. In the whole community that actually surrounds this plaza, many of the buildings are Spanish colonial revival, which was very popular at that time. Through advocacy and documentation, the buildings went through the rigorous process of nomination, and they were recently awarded a spot on the National Historic Register of Places this summer. So that is another new historic landmark for our South Bay communities here. So this is pretty much my presentation as a lead-in, and I want to thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions later on, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Does anybody have any questions right now? Or I do say that Robert Johnson and I were involved in attempting to preserve the contents of a couple of those time capsules at Compton High School. There were some indeed destroyed by water, and actually some of the ones that weren't destroyed had water damage, and we're still working towards possibly getting the contents of those things to the Gerth archives. I don't know if you were going to talk about that or not, Robert. But.
Well, that's okay. I just wanted to mention that, and everybody who's interested in preservation should contact the Compton Unified School District, because right now the holdup is in administration. And right now they have everything in a drawer somewhere. And I imagine, in my mind's eye, I see mold just growing on everything, okay? Greg has been very nice and offered his services and the services of the archive to help preserve what's been recovered. And unfortunately, they don't see the urgency, and there's some administrators who are dragging their feet. And time is, is not on our side with this. Several of the time capsules were lost, as was mentioned before. But what we do have from the cornerstone from 1904, then again, because they opened it in 1935 and put more stuff in, that's what survived. And the way it was damaged, and like I said, the university, Greg has really offered to do a seminar for the school district so that they could properly excavate time capsules. They had the construction crew open the time capsule, and that's how it got damaged, because they had no idea what they were doing. They were cutting through the concrete using a water saw, and the water got in it. So, of course it upsets me, but I can't blame them because they didn't know any better. But we have resources, and Cal State Dominguez Hills is a great resource. That should not be happening because we have the skills and the resources to actually excavate these time capsules in a correct way.
All right, any other questions for Debbie?
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Debbie to share, because I know that with the city of Compton, one of the reasons that the community wasn't able to, those who were interested, save that campus or any parts of it is because of the city doesn't have a current preservation ordinance. By Compton being one of the oldest cities, one of the top 10 oldest cities in the county of Los Angeles, that has to be addressed. We need an ordinance for that city so we can start preserving our landmarks.
Yes.
So that's one thing, Debbie, that you can maybe speak on. And we talked about that during the summer, I think.
Yes. One of the things is because there is no ordinance, there are specific guidelines that have to be followed, like most planning departments in most cities have rules that are set up by the federal government through the National Trust. Environmental impact studies or environmental impact reports, which are labeled EIRs, they allow for cities that have clout or teeth and rules to go in and direct, say for instance, construction crews, to go in and properly follow guidelines. And they are also warned if you find anything that looks like it's historic or something that's questionable, you must stop all activity on that site. And then archaeologists or whoever are asked to come in and look at, say for instance, like Robert was saying, those time capsules that was in that cornerstone. Before projects even start demolition, normally when there's a, what do we call, again, a historic rules, you have to go in and have public meetings where the public comes in and voices their concerns. You follow those guidelines. A consulting firm is usually hired to write up that environmental report stating either this place is historic or not, or we have findings stating so forth and so on. And apparently, from what I've been told, the environmental impact report for Compton High, the consultants felt that none of the buildings or any of the historic fabric there that we know to be historic, they deemed they weren't. But even looking at the national guidelines, there are three things: either a connection to historic architecture, connection to historic or famous persons, and the age of the building. Those buildings met all three of those criteria. So this is why it's such a great loss for us. But because there was no ordinance, nobody could actually use any laws or anything to stop them from moving forward.
All right. Our next speaker, Tony, did you want to introduce? Before you introduce him, no, go ahead.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, our next presenter is going to be, he's actually a board member for the Compton Historical Society, and he's an educator. He's a teacher at Dominguez High School in Compton. I believe he's also the lead teacher over there for the lead music teacher. But Ricardo Reyes is a friend of ours. He's a historian in his own right. And he's an educator, like I just said, a teacher at Dominguez High School for many years. So I want to introduce to you and welcome to others, Mr. Ricardo Reyes.
Do the unmute, unmute.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there you
You're
go.
up.
You're muted,
Ricardo,
Ricardo.
you gotta unmute. No, no, no.
Still,
I'm
there you
sorry.
go.
I'm
There
sorry.
you go.
There you go.
Thank you, Tony, for the introduction. And there's a lot of information that probably could be shared. There's a lot of people with my name, so I use the middle name Padilla to distinguish myself. And I am not the lead music teacher, although I graduated from Dominguez, a member of the band, the Compton Youth Orchestras, a private teacher, who was a jazz master as well. And, music was my calling, but, the activism of the late 60s, 70s pulled me into political science and, studied history as well at Occidental College under the son of Adolph Kroeber. If any of you know him from Berkeley, he was the one that did the anthropology research on the last surviving Native American Ishi of a tribe that they could not pronounce her name. And, Mr. Kroeber was very knowledgeable in Mexico. And, I have other degrees and so forth, but, being a native of Compton, it's been instilled in me since a young person, so much about the Dominguez family, the heritage of Compton, the individuals that have gone there, Polly Bergen, of course, James Coburn, another actor, and so many others that we need to really congregate their information and their stories. Some of them are still alive or their descendants. I found out from a former student who just passed away after I interviewed her that Stephen Fetchit attended Compton. His son attended Compton High School. So there's a lot of interesting stories there that need to be dug up. And Compton High School was rebuilt after the 33 earthquake. And many of these stone, actually brick buildings, especially in Long Beach Poly High School and the downtown area, were not up to par with the earthquake prevention. And there were no standards. And that's what happens when we don't have standards. So the Field Act was involved. And yes, we know if we're past a certain age who Tokyo Rose is, although her real name was Iva Toguri, and I'll be speaking about her. She attended the high school and graduated right during the time when the buildings collapsed in 33 March, and then they had tents. And it was also a dual purpose campus with Compton Junior College, where she attended and graduated before going on to UCLA. But when we talk about landmarks, certainly we need to commemorate her. And right now, history is showing that she was a victim, wrongfully accused of being doing treasonous acts. And I'll get into a little bit of that history because I wanted to also talk about Yuri Kochiyama, who attended Compton Junior College, even though she was from San Pedro. But if we look at her as a modern day civil rights leader, passed away about 4 years ago, and she's credited with being very close to Malcolm X, that famous Life magazine photo where he has been assassinated. She's holding up his head. Well, there are commentaries from professors saying that we cannot look at her in light of that she was close to a great hero because she was one in her own right. And I will not be able to speak about her as much as I would like because I was told to keep it, short and brief. And Tokyo Rose, Iva Toguri, I'm condensing years of research on her into maybe just 15, 20 minutes and really just skimming the tree tops and trying to personalize it more than just recitation from books and articles that are extensive on her, as well as Yuri Kochiyama has so many videos and interviews, documents, that because she lived in New York and Harlem, where they moved her and her husband after the incarceration because they felt that the West Coast was just so anti-Japanese. And also that occurred with Tokyo Rose's, and I keep saying Tokyo, but Iva Toguri's father, who had a little grocery store on Wilmington in the intersection of Stockwell, which they're right there at the nexus of Compton and Willowbrook. because that city-county boundary is not a straight one. It's very jagged, but their house and business was on the Compton side. And from there, he had moved from Calexico, San Diego with the family, and she entered the high school and then drove to UCLA every day that she had classes, probably carpooled, worked in the family store. And so that house that is just right around the corner from the store should be a landmark, as well as that little storefront, if we can pinpoint them. I've driven by with the addresses I have from some of the government documents. I need to research the census exactly which resident they were in. But it's all walking distance back and forth with their little family business. And the father was able to defend his daughter during the San Francisco trial of 48 after World War II with the money that he had accumulated. Even though he had been incarcerated, he turned his business over to an African-American male friend. And I don't know how he was able to amass money to be able to be there at the trial and to get a defense attorney, because the government had the longest trial on her treason charges. And I'll get into the causes of the treason charges. And it lasted 2.5 months and became the most expensive federal criminal trial. And as you know, treason is the only crime that is specified in the Constitution. And there's only been like 7 people convicted of it, and she's the only one that was pardoned by President General Ford a few days before his departure from the White House. And she was vindicated, but she spent 7 of 10 years in jail. And I'm going to look into the reasons why she was used as a sacrificial lamb. Once again, the point being that when the father finished defending his daughter unsuccessfully, he moved the family business to Chicago and called it to Taguri gift shop or gift store. And they had a tall building, multi-story. And then she ended up working there, very quietly, unassuming, didn't want any attention whatsoever. And it's an interesting closure to a life that started out with full of American dreams. She liked hamburgers more than white rice and fish. She didn't speak very much Japanese, if any at all. And she was a Bobby Soxer. She loved swing music. She played tennis, just like Yuri Kochiyama. She played tennis. And Yuri, 4 years younger, was the student body president, the first female at San Pedro High School, which is predominantly in the white part of town. Her father owned a fishery processing plant in Terminal Island, and they were upscale, well-to-do, and she led a very normal American life, very much like Iva Taguri. The parents wanted them to integrate into society and, did not really shelter them from American society, but encourage them. So if they went home, maybe they were speaking some Japanese, but it was English. And maybe they would speak to their parents in English, and then the parents might speak to each other in Japanese. So you have that thing that's very common, even in Latino households. But when we get to Iva Taguri, she had graduated from UCLA and was attending graduate studies to be a doctor. She had majored in zoology. And she was the first wave of Japanese Americans who had entered the university system and were destined for professional jobs if they could find them. And there was a lot of discrimination, and well-known individuals, if they even attended MIT, had to go to Japan to get a job because they couldn't get it in the US, hoping to return one day, in which they did, but maybe under a different profession than the one in which they studied. There were no Japanese American teachers. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but that first wave was plucked out, just like happened to Yuri, incarcerated along with their family, along that strip of border, running from Washington through even southern Arizona, not the entire states, but like a 150-mile band from the coast, considered to be the at-risk area, away from the coast. And as we know, Terminal Island had 3,000 Japanese Americans, and they were moved. And in fact, Yuri's father was picked up just a couple of days after Pearl Harbor, because he was considered very suspicious, having photos of naval ships. Well, that is not uncommon if you live along the coast. You go to the ceremonies where the ships dock in, and then you take photos. They got bands, all kinds of things in that order. So he had just been released from the hospital. They picked him up for 6 weeks of intensive questioning. When they dropped him off, he died just a few days later. And then the whole family was incarcerated, but not in the Western area, in Jerome, Arkansas, which is the South. And that's really where Yuri Kochiyama was radicalized, to see the treatment of the African Americans, and why probably her and her husband, who was a member of the U.S. Army 442 Regiment, probably considered the most highly accorded, rewarded, medaled unit in all of World War II, and they fought in Italy. Well, that's where, when he got out of the Army, they decided to move to Harlem and rented in a housing unit, and were community activists with the African Americans. And journalists, once they found out what Yuri was about, they would go talking and asking people, says, well, isn't it unusual for Yuri, who's not African American, to be involved in these community organizations? Why isn't he, is there any thoughts on that? And the one African American man says, well, look, it's not unusual, except when she doesn't show up. We wonder, where is she? She was part of this movement that we on the West Coast were unaware of. And her name now is surfacing and has extensive research. And I'd like to do a presentation about her more in depth, but I'm going to go back to Iva Taguri, because how could she commit treason in the US when no Japanese American in our incarceration camps was accused, much less convicted, of treasonous acts? Sure, there were some that were shot with some riots on the camps, but basically because of their the hostile conditions they had to endure, and they resented it. And there were machine guns in these camps to protect them when they were pointed inwards. So Iva, as soon as she graduated from UCLA, she was in graduate school. Her mother heard news that her sister, older sister, Iva's mother, aunt, was ill, and they needed help. So Iva went off on a ship. She was there a few months. Culture shock, extreme culture shock. She didn't want to be there. She couldn't understand anybody. And even the relatives looked at her like strange. And so she booked a return passage, but because there were questions about her temporary passport documents, she couldn't get the US State Department to approve her leaving Japan. And a few days before Pearl Harbor, the ship sailed out, and I've read that it had to return to Tokyo once war conditions broke out. But she was stuck in Tokyo, and her family couldn't have her because they were facing so much harassment from the Japanese police, neighbors, society, everybody. In fact, the Japanese police, which are pretty much a military police, were telling Iva, look, you either renounce your US citizenship or we're going to put you in internment. She says, well, I don't have any food or any job, any means of support. Please put me in jail. And then they talked and they says, well, you know what? It's going to cost us a lot of money, so you're on your own. But they monitored her very closely. So she had to go out and look for a job for a few dollars a day. And because she spoke English, she got a job as a clerk. And eventually, in two jobs she had, one in a consulate, I forget which country, You know, it might have been Poland, it might have been Portugal, but her husband was Japanese Portuguese. And the Portuguese government offered her citizenship. And she says, no, I'm an American. And I always will be. There was no way she could leave Tokyo. And there were other Japanese Americans in the same situation there. And most of them renounced their US citizenship. There are even former NCAA, if that was the organization at the time, football players on championship teams that were there in Tokyo and working in the broadcast station. Well, eventually, Iowa was coached by an Australian officer who had come out of the entertainment industry and was told either you will starve in a hot box or you will have a good little room with meals if you help put out broadcast. And the broadcast went out from major cities where the Japanese had control, Shanghai, Manila, etc., and even into the islands, where especially as American soldiers approached. And there were a number of broadcasters speaking English, not just Iva Taguri. How did the name Tokyo Rose get attached to her? Well, the war ended. She was run out of money, couldn't afford passage, didn't have the passport. And she heard that two journalists from the US were offering a really large sum of money to find out who was Tokyo Rose. And these journalists were competing. It was a race with MacArthur and his high officers, intelligence officers, to identify Tokyo Rose. This myth was created that there was one who was undermining and demoralizing the US soldiers with these weekly or daily radio broadcasts that included also swing music and ideas like, well, what are you doing, GI boys, when your girlfriend is at home with somebody else? So all of these stories were concocted and brewed. And then I was said, well, you know what? I'll beat Tokyo Rose if you're going to give me the money, because I got to get back home. And she thought it was just like, you know, no big deal. The war's over. I'm an American. I need to go home. Well, she got put in military prison. And all along during her whole years, even when she was in Compton, she had, you know, some severe illnesses and she would get over them. But in Japan, the stress really got to her. And, you know, she had to undergo some medical illnesses and fight the pressures to bear on her. And so finally he put her on a ship, a military escort, and brought her to San Francisco because they couldn't fly her because the federal charges against her would be brought at the port of entry. And they wanted her tried in San Francisco because that's where they had their powerhouse attorneys and federal judges and so forth. And the case was made across the nation by this radio commentator, sensationalist, Walter Winchell, attacking her. And we see a lot of the similar things happening this day where they pick on somebody and create a story and go after them mercilessly. But Tokyo Rose was that an international notorious person. And she, of course, was convicted, went into a federal jail, and a journalist out of Chicago found out about the case and interviewed many of the witnesses, went back to those involved in the court case and realized that everything had been trumped up, no pun intended. And Gerald Ford, just days before his departure from the White House, pardoned her. And now we have a lot of books and materials talking about her as a hero. I've got lists of books that I've read, some of the titles. One of them is written by a Japanese woman who moved to the US, called Tokyo Rose, Orphan of the Pacific, because Iva Taguri went by the radio name Orphan Annie because she felt abandoned. A more recent book, Tokyo Rose, An American Patriot, a dual biography published about 10 years ago, talks in two stories, the Tokyo Rose and the Iva Taguri, to show how there was a conflict, a contradiction, and that the hyperbole wasn't warranted about her. And yeah, there's another, yeah, okay, there's a few more books. But before I finish on Iva, and the fact that she led a sedate life, and her husband was not allowed entry into the US. So the one love of her life was gone. And she led a solitary life. And who knows what she did in her latter years except work diligently in the family business, which her brother took over. Now, I'd like to recommend two books for general background on the Asian American situation. The first is The Bamboo People, The Law and Japanese Americans by Frank Schumann. It talks about the treatment of Asians in the US since the 1890s, very historical in its sequential developments, and painting the chapters that they had to undergo. And the other book is by Carrie McWilliams, the noted muckraker, author, activist, called Prejudiced Japanese Americans, written towards the end of World War II on a symbol of racial intolerance, where he really breaks down the case that the Japanese American incarceration was basically cruel and unusual and unjustified. And the climate continued, especially after World War II, that of such hostility that the Japanese Americans, many didn't want to come back to the West Coast. They had very few places to go, and some did, but others that had opportunities went elsewhere. So that is concluding my remarks. Two different individuals, they both played tennis, but remarkably different experiences. I'm sure that if Eva had remained in the US, she'd be anonymous, had gone to, one of the camps, moved on with her life, perhaps pursued her education, who knows? But she became a cause célèbre. And I think she deserves recognition in Compton, and a plaque would be minimal, nominal. So thank you for allowing me to speak to her, about her, Iva Taguri. And thank you. So if you have any questions, I'm here.
Thank you, Ricardo. Does anybody have any questions? Joshua Jeffers, you have a question? Can you, or you're just clapping? Okay. Okay, before we
Greg, let me ask a question, but because I know that you wrote a book about Dominguez Hills, and this is to both you or Ricardo. Could you tell us more about the Asian community in and around the city of Compton?
May I address that first?
Sure.
Sure.
I remember Robert Harada coming up to school with the only Asian. And then I found out by going back and looking at old school annual, especially Compton High School, there would be like 70 to 100 Japanese Americans, students, Japanese American Society. And then I bought one that showed them at the beginning of the year, and then the next year they weren't there. So the research shows that there was a strong Japanese American community in Compton, probably, in that Compton, Willowbrook borderline area, but that the farmers that worked Dominguez Hills and Palos Verdes extensively would drive in from like Little Tokyo where they lived every day. And people that are farming, they're up at 3 or 4 in the morning. In fact, the last Japanese farm, Haratano, I've been reading in Palos Verdes, even though he passed away 5 years ago, is now being taken over and put out for competitive bid. And the foreman, a Latino who came from Mexico, had been working it diligently. You know, they're growing nopal and a lot of other plants. So that chapter of Japanese Americans in the Palos Verdes is coming to an end. And do we know many of the gardeners in Gardena were those that had been in incarceration? I mean, we had nurseries in Compton, the chicken farm over on Central and Rosecrans was Japanese American, where the Fat Burgers is now. Their children went on for professional degrees. They didn't want to be gardeners, landscapers, etc. And very few did pursue that trade, but they moved to Central California, away from the coastal regions. So I don't know if I'm able to encapsulate everything about the Japanese American community, you know, because there's much more that we need to research.
The Gerth Archives has been doing a project for the last 7 or 8 years entitled CSU Japanese American Digitization Project. It has taken materials on Japanese American incarceration during World War II and put them in a database. It's taken from 29 different institutions, including most recently the California Historical Society, in which we accepted material related to Fred Korematsu, who was part of the famous Supreme Court case. But around Compton, around Gardena, and elsewhere, there's an enormous amount of resources in CSUDH. We have 80,000 items now, and we continue to grow that. It's quite heartening to see that we continue to get material every day. I was in a storage bin in Hollywood, or is it somewhere in LA, off the 101 yesterday, and I found the art drawings of Hart Mountain in Wyoming, the camp there. So what's amazing is that stuff is still out there, and it's going to contribute to the story, and CSUDH has contributed to that story. And we continue to collect materials. We were in Gardena a couple of weeks ago and collected some of the papers of State Representative Benai, who was one of the first Japanese Americans to be a state representative in California. So those resources are there. I would encourage you to go to CSUDH and go find out more about that. We do have some material on Yuri Kochiyama in the archives. I know there was sort of like a newsletter that her family put out. Any other questions?
Well, let me say this real quick. You know, when you come up to the library, you see the bust of Mervyn Dimely when you come out of the elevator. And Mervyn Dimely, along with one of his aides, Mia Iwataki, were involved with getting legislation through for reparations for interned Japanese. So I just wanted to throw that in there. That's that Dominguez Hills connection.
Yeah. And additionally, all the farmers that on the Dominguez lands that Ricardo mentioned, we have their leases in our archive, right, and we've digitized all of those leases. So that sort of evolves into a genealogy type project, but really reflects the hardships that the Japanese Americans had to go through just to get work, to lease land. They couldn't buy it. Our next before we go on, there's been a chat. If you want to take a look at the chat, there's a discussion about getting the designation for legislation in Compton for
an ordinance.
Yeah, an ordinance. And so if you want to take a look at that, you're welcome to. But now I will introduce Robert Lee Johnson as our next speaker.
You have my bio, right?
I'm going to read parts of it. Maybe I'll read all of it. What would you? Robert Lee Johnson lectures on the subject of local history at colleges, universities, and museums in Southern California. He is a member of the History Council and chairman of the Projects Committee at the California African American Museum and Exhibition Park. He is a founding member of the Compton 125 Historical Society and has been featured in documentaries, some of which he's filmed on the 5th floor in Dominguez at the Gerth Archives, The Streets of Compton, Compton's Finest, LA Displacement in Utopia, and the BBC's documentary on Nipsey Hussle. I had to talk to you about this piece of art that a student at Dominguez Hills did of Nipsey Hussle, but it is so big, we can't store it in certain places, but I'll talk to you about that later. Robert is a consultant on the award-winning documentary Fire on the Hill. He is, of course, the author of the book Images of America, Compton, and has written articles for newspapers and magazines. His articles on George Floyd's torture and murder, called Tipping Point, and a review of the Fred Hampton biopic, Judas and the Black Messiah, were well received. Robert is a former leading member of the Compton branch of the Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party, and a founding member of the Coalition Against Police Abuse in the 1970s. In the 1980s, he was named a plaintiff in the notorious spying scandal that involved the Los Angeles Police Department's Public Disorder Intelligence Division. His latest book, it's a great one, Notable Southern Californians in Black History, has been published by the History Press. And he is currently, and we are waiting patiently or impatiently for his next book on the Watts Willowbrook district of Los Angeles. Without further ado, here's Robert Lee Johnson.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. I'm glad that you like the current book. Yes, please, everybody go out and get it, please. Debbie says, yeah, she laughs. Anyway, why do we have landmarks? You know, whenever I think of landmarks, you know, you think of Washington, D.C. You know, why did they decide to put up, you know, different landmarks to historic individuals? Basically, so they'll be remembered, so that you can tell those stories. You know, that's why we want landmarks, so that we can say, wait a minute, something happened here that was important to our community, okay, and to ourselves. What was it that happened? Otherwise, we just walk right past it and we lose the story. And I'll give you an example. How many, well, I'm not going to get a show of hands, but not many people have heard of Gordon Manor. Gordon Manor was going to be a development, a Black community built in the 1920s, in the mid-20s. Dr. Gordon had come up with the money, and you know, he syndicated it with other financial institutions to build a community to take Black people off of Central Avenue into an area that was actually, he negotiated with the Dominguez family, one of the lawyers, to basically buy this piece of land and build a community on it. And this was in the mid-20s. Of course, the same thing that happened to Bruce's Beach happened to Gordon Manor. There were some very wealthy interests in Palos Verdes, including Henry O'Meara, who was the attorney for the Dominguez family. Many of you might know he was the founder of the gigantic law firm, Henry Myers, which represents the city of Los Angeles. It's a worldwide law firm now. But at that time, he had just become famous after the Teapot Dome scandal, where he saved Doheny. So he was like a celebrity. And so they actually shut down Gordon Manor. They said, oh, we're going to build a park. Does that sound familiar? 30 years later, they built El Camino College and Alondra Park there. So we don't know what happened there because there's nothing there to tell us. There's no plaque, there's no landmark. So we don't know that story. Of course, 20 years later, and some of us know this story, 20 years later, Velma Grant buys land in Willowbrook, which is now Willowbrook, from, I think of the name of the place now. Anyway, there was a farm family out of Compton. Ricardo, you know the answer to this question. Before it was Gonzalez Park, it was
Cressy.
Thank you, the Cressy family. It was land owned by the Cressy family. She bought that and built houses there in the 1940s, right after World War II. Okay, and it was open. That was the unique thing about it. It was open to everyone, which meant basically Black people came to live there. Homes were designed by Paul Williams. They were quality homes. If you go down El Segundo and turn on Stanford today, you can tell the difference between those homes and the surrounding homes that were built later, simply because of the quality of the workmanship and the design. Of course, again, she went out to San Bernardino in the early 50s and built the Carverdale homes. Same structure, they're still there, they still look great. Because of what she did, she put over 300 Black homeowning families on the northwest border of the city of Compton in the 1940s. By the 1930s, you had over 300 families that were right on the border. Compton was very white and Mormon. And the reason I mentioned Mormons is simply because during that time, Mormons did not believe that Black people had souls. Evidently, they did not meet Aretha Franklin or James Brown. But, you see, Ricardo got it. Anyway, they started a movement. They were so upset called Keep the Negroes, and I'm being kind, north of 130, I believe 137th Street. They were trying to keep Compton all white, but just through inertia, Black folks started buying homes into Compton because of the proximity of Carver Manor. Eventually, by 1960, you had a lot of Black people living on the west side of Compton, including my family. Mainly because of Velma Grant. Unsung hero. I know Debbie's involved with trying to get her some recognition, but right now we don't have a landmark for her. There were a group of people saying, let's put some statues up of Black females. They don't even know who Velma Grant was. They have a list of people, but they missed that. Every young woman, Black or white or Hispanic, everybody should know who she was to see what she was able to do in 1946. She got almost $3 million to build that community from Bank of America at the time when white women couldn't get a credit card. So you know she had to be innovative, okay? Anyway, this is why I'm saying landmarks, because if you see a landmark there, then you're gonna have to know the story. If there was a landmark for Dr. Gordon, you'd wanna know his story. If there's a landmark for Velma Grant, then you're gonna wanna know her story. And if you learn her story, you're gonna start to learn about the story of the city of Compton. Or at least Willowbrook. So this is why landmarks are important. That's why we specify them, to tell our story. I don't care which community, we have to tell our stories, because otherwise our stories get overlooked. I mean, imagine today, we already know. If you ask people, how did California enter the United States? They don't know. They act like it was one of the, or maybe one of the original 13 colonies, or the 14th, it was out west, I don't know. Very few understand about the Mexican-American War and how this is conquered land. If you ask anybody about the treaty that ended the fighting here, they have no clue. What happened to Campo Cahuenga? Well, luckily that's still there. I mean, they reconstructed it. It's directly across from Universal Studios on Lakersham. You go right out, they reconstructed it. And then they do a farce every year. Robert, this is my opinion, but evidently I got to get an agreement, Mr. Reyes. They do a farcical reenactment of the capitulation. Have you been to one?
I've been to some other activities there, and the individuals were like, brainwashed.
Yes, they're not telling the story. I got there when I was so.
Fremont is a scoundrel if you look at his historical, some of the books written about his character, his development.
Women who? Say that again.
Fremont's credited with Cahuenga.
Oh, yes, yes.
But he was like not going to the battles. He was like in the hillsides, going slow with his ground troops. He didn't want to get in the battles, but he took claim during the treaty. And that's
one day you and I have to talk about the Berriesis incident, where he actually executed two teenage Mexican soldiers.
Too young.
Yeah, I'm probably butchering the name. You'd say it better.
Well, there's a
Anyway.
tail end, but anyway, Berriesis.
Yes, thank you. See, I knew it. It even sounds better when you say it. Anyway, when we don't have a monument or a way to know about these things, you know, you have these types of reenactments. I actually sat through the reenactment. And if you don't know anything, you know, if you're not really familiar with California history, you would look at that reenactment and say, wow, the Californios were so happy that the Americans came and took over. If you get a chance, they have it, I believe it's around January 13th. Go look. They threw me out one time because I was, yeah, Greg laughed. They had me leave because I was handing out, you know, everybody puts out their own documents. I made a copy from actually the U.S. Park Service, which is a very good source, of a letter that Jose Maria Pico from San Jose had sent to the United States Senate, talking about how the treaty, the capitulation at Cahuenga, had been violated. Because in that treaty, it says you can keep your land, you can keep your language, just basically stop shooting at us, okay? But then in 1850, they came up with the Land Commission to try to figure out how to get the land from the Californians, which basically they said, prove you own the land. So we would not know these stories without a landmark. We would be looking at these reenactments as if they had some sort of historic significance. They actually had in the reenactment they have Colonel Fremont meeting with General Andreas Pico, and they have Andreas Pico talking about how the Mexican government of California was basically corrupt, and he's so happy that the Americans are here, without telling us that he's talking about his brother who was the governor. So obviously these things didn't happen. Somebody just wrote their own script. But the majority of the people who were there, they don't know. They know what's put in front of them. We have to tell our own stories. We have to look and we have to make our own landmarks so we can tell our stories. So people can ask questions, how did we get here? You know, we talk about youth right now. And when we look at the youth, there's a disconnect. Because in reality, they don't understand, how did we get here? I was lucky enough to come up in Compton during a time when the status quo was being challenged. We had teachers who were coming directly off of the battlefield of civil rights. They were coming from historically Black colleges and universities. They were teachers, and they came to Compton because Compton was the only, in California, the only school that had a Black superintendent and city council. We were the Black city. And when they came to us, they were dealing with these students that they wanted to give this knowledge to. They were enthusiastic teachers. I mean, they weren't talking down to you or anything like that. They were trying to deal with some of the problems that they were trying to deal with as college students. I mean, you didn't go to many places where you started your morning singing the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, okay? I did. We talk about Compton High School. You talk to anybody who went to Compton High School during the time I was there, and they will tell you, morning routine, lift every voice and sing. We talked about who was getting into college, who got what grants, who got what, because the idea was to let us see at that time, and this is the early 70s, look, you can do it. People are doing these things. There are new opportunities that we need to take a hold of. That was because someone was telling us and pointing that way. When I was in junior high school at General Benjamin O. Davis Junior High School, Tuskegee Airmen, okay? We went on a field trip to the Dominguez Adobe. I had never heard of the Dominguez Adobe, even though I was living on Dominguez land since I got to Compton, okay? And it was like, wow, they own this? Because it wasn't just the idea of someone owning all that land from basically Rosecrans Boulevard to Palos Verdes to the Los Angeles River to Redondo Beach was mind-boggling. And then to understand, well, wait a minute, if he owned all this land, well, what happened? Where did all these little cities come from? And so trying to understand and go backwards and say, what happened? How did these rancheros, how did they lose their land? They had it in 1850, but by the 1890s, there's a huge transfer of wealth. How did that happen? What happened? So that's when you learn about people like Senator William Gwynn and the committee that was set up, or the land commission that was set up to put the onus on the landowner to prove you own the land. And if you couldn't prove it, they took the land from you.
And you had to drive on horse wagon to San Francisco for those.
Well, some of the lucky ones took the speedboat up, but yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, they made it very, very difficult. That's right. Ricardo said you couldn't just do it locally. You also had to go.
One meeting in Southern California, one meeting.
Oh, okay. One meeting. One meeting out of how many?
Who knows?
Exactly.
How many behind the closed doors? These were not public affairs. There was no Brown Act.
Yes. And the idea is, for us to really understand, the idea was to take the land away. It wasn't supposed to be. The reason they came up with the Land Commission was to circumvent the treaty. You could keep your land, keep your language. They said, oh no, how do we have new Americans coming? And look at all this land that the Californios have, because keep in mind, the average American farmer, their farm was between 40 and 80 acres. But now they're looking at somebody with 177,000 acres. Oh, they're wasting that land or whatever. But to learn what happened, how do we get from here to there? A huge transfer of wealth took place. So who became wealthy and who was left impoverished? Who defined what it meant to be a citizen and who defined what it was not to be a citizen?
Could I add on this point, Robert? Sorry to interrupt. John Fremont took over the Mariposa Ranch and changed the boundaries to have access to gold territory.
You know, one of the real funny things, Ricardo, is that both Fremont and the senator, I just mentioned him, I forgot his name that fast. They both end up on land that has millions of dollars worth of gold under it. You know, and Fremont was on supposed to be a topographical research expedition that we know was basically a thinly veiled military patrol. Okay, but these guys knew where gold veins were, obviously, because they bought land on top of it and became quite wealthy. So the idea is, you know, just to get back on track, is that if we had landmarks to make people ask the story, we would probably get the story, okay? The real story, but right now it's not even mentioned.
And Robert, there's speaking of the Fremonts, there's this thing in history where celebrities or journalists write history, and there's a whole thing related to Bill O'Reilly and those other Fox people, but Steve Inskeep, who is actually a legitimate journalist for NPR, just wrote a book last year called Imperfect Union: How Jesse and John Fremont Mapped the West, Invented Celebrity, and Helped Cause the Civil War. So what I guess my point for here is that Fremont is still in the consciousness of the history, and he's a big history, he's out there. And what you're advocating for is these other folks, and I think you're on the correct trail. It's just that that's a very big job, and I think that has started. Do you have any? Sorry to interrupt, but after you finish your thought, do you have any opinions on what is your opinion on the current removal of certain landmarks and statues around the country? And who do you think should represent California in the Capitol Rotunda?
Okay.
Do you know who's in the Capitol Rotunda right now?
No, I don't. Who
It's
is?
Ronald Reagan, Junipero Serra, and somebody else. And it used to be, there was a guy who kept California in the Union in the 1860s, that they replaced him with Reagan. So go for it.
Well, I'll have to think about the replacements there, but you know, Fremont was such a unique character in history. You know, it's like you can't make him a good guy, bad guy. I mean, later on, of course, in the Civil War, you know, he emancipates a bunch of people in Missouri. And then Lincoln has to go back and say, no, we don't want to do that yet. So, you know, you kind of get this duality with Fremont, okay? And you find that a lot of times. You know, you look to see what people have done. So, I mean, it's really hard to say. I'm gonna have to think about the other one with the statuary there for a second, because there's so many.
Debbie, do you have any opinion on that topic?
I'll
Yes,
just say
I
one.
think
Dolores worked.
native, at least one of the native peoples, a representation, the Kauai or some of the other groups here, the Modocs, somebody. I mean, if we got indigenous woman on the Los Angeles County flag with her basket, one indigenous person needs to be represented in Washington. At least one needs to be in that statuary.
I like that with the Modoc, because yeah, Captain Jack, he would be a great one. I would vote for that one.
I was able to find a book that I've been searching for, an original first edition of a book that I've been searching for a few years, and I just got it into the library. It is Mrs. Beasley's Histories of Blacks in California that she wrote in 1919.
Mhm.
And she went and she basically researched at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, going through newspapers, and that is this type of history. Archivist's job is to make this stuff accessible and find it, and that's what we like to do in that regard. Anyways, go ahead.
So, oh, I thought Debbie, I thought you were about to say
Oh
something.
no, I was thinking out loud, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just have a big thing about the county being so enlightened. And the county plays a big part in my life because my father worked there. My two first cousins worked there. I eventually worked there doing some work. And it's like, I walked outside of the building one day and I looked up and there's this woman and she's on the flag. And I'm like, okay. Because when I was little, I remember seeing all the images that are on the county seal, like the Hollywood Bowl and a sailing ship and some other stuff. And in the middle was this Roman goddess, Pomona, and she's got on, that's who was on that flag and on that county seal for years, because she represented the so-called food basket, the farms out in Pomona, near what's now Cal Poly Pomona. And she was on that flag forever. And when she was no longer there, I said, somebody's enlightened. Somebody's finally telling the truth about who was here first.
Well, if you guys ever get a copy of my book, Notable Southern Californians in Black History, you will see that I give a shout out to Delilah Beasley and Marion Matthews. One, because I use some of their work in that book in particular. So I would, and unfortunately, Delilah Beasley, she suffered for her work. She really did. So, her story is an important one, but she was really into preserving that history. And again, for people on the flag, when we talk about California, Queen Calafia, which was a mythical queen, okay? She was the subject of a book, but it was, she was supposed to be the leader of a group of Black African Amazons. Yes. So when you think of Wonder Woman, they talk about she comes from the island with Amazons. Okay, it's part of that story. They just made Wonder Woman white with, when in fact, if you look at the actual book, they talk about these Black Amazons who they rode flying griffins and had breastplates of gold with diamonds in it. This guy was, when he was writing this book, he was serious. So, but it's how California got its name. I ask people, sometimes when I'm doing a lecture, I'll say, could you name me a city in Southern California that's named after an African woman?
Calafia.
And people look at me like what? A major Southern California city, y'all probably go every day, and they go, what? Santa Monica. Okay, I went to Our Lady of Victory in Compton, and I grew up Catholic.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
Saint Monica was the mother of Saint Augustine. They were from North Africa. Saint Augustine, as some of us know, was a major theologian in the Catholic Church. But his mother was also a saint, and they named Santa Monica after her. But we don't know that because there's not a plaque or landmark that states Santa Monica. This is, as far as I know, might be one but I haven't seen it.
There's a statue of her, but they don't talk about her North African heritage.
Well, have you seen the commercial about the almond milk and all that from Calafia Farms?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. So we have these things, but again, we don't get the historical background because, again, we're looking at landmarks. We have to put those together because we have to be able to tell our story. And if we don't have that ability to do that, then we lose the story. Somebody else might tell the story, but they'll get it wrong. They'll twist it, whichever way that suits them, either personally or politically. But that's the importance of landmarks. How am I doing for time, Greg?
You're done.
Okay. Well,
You
put a
done.
fork in it, it's done.
But you froze.
And I hope you guys keep that in mind. Hey, if you get a chance, go out and get my book, Notable Southern Californians in Black History. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. What was I going to say? There was something else I wanted to mention, but does anybody else have any questions for Robert before we move to our next speaker? All right.
May I add something for Robert? Robert, why didn't you mention Pio Pico as a statue? Maybe have a triumvirate there?
Oh, that would be great. I would love to see one of the things that I love to tell people. Beg pardon?
Last Mexican governor?
Yes.
In
And
California.
keep in mind, his brother Andreas was the last military leader under Mexican rule.
Yeah.
So when you hear about the Mexican-American War and they're coming to fight in California, the leaders that they were fighting against were two men of African descent. Okay, so then also think about their mindset. Read anything by Kit Carson about their mindset, which was extremely racist, about the people who lived in California. And then, what was his name, Burnett? Find out who that first California governor was under American rule. Okay, because he had a history.
Charles Burnett? I don't know.
Yeah, he came from the Oregon Territory. He was the one that came up with the rules to expel all the Black people out of the Oregon Territory.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, they got caught first, you flogged them so many times, and then the second time they doubled it and so on. Okay, so
Go ahead.
I would enjoy that.
One history, sorry, Robert. One funny story, well, not funny, but a story we had on the Dominguez campus, we had a marker, a historical marker for the 1910 air meet. And there's actually another one a mile away, but this was a small one on the campus. And during our recent renovations, they dug it up.
Oh.
It was planted there by the Society of Pioneers, ladies.
Mhm.
And in the 30s and 40s, both this group, the Pioneer, I don't know, I guess there was a men's group and a women's group, planted a lot of historical markers throughout California. And they were often nasty toward Native Americans and other folk. And we did get a time capsule out of there that was planted in 1974, which we found various things. And that was interesting. But what I guess my point is that perhaps it's time for a movement, for another organization to develop and plot out who should be represented. And of course, that'd be controversial and everything, but nevertheless,
that's the fun part, Greg.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, our next speaker is Amalia Castañeda. She is the university archivist at California State University, Dominguez Hills. She has a master's degree in library science from UCLA. She has a master's degree in history, a master's of arts degree in history from California State University, Los Angeles. She has been an archivist at CSUDH and a librarian, and she's been a archivist at Cal State LA. She's worked in UCLA Special Collections. She interned at the Library of Congress, and she actually attended the University of Chicago Special Collections Preservation. She didn't attend it, she was an intern there. She's written a few articles on fostering diversity in special collections, librarianship. The theme of her Masters of History's thesis related to the Plaza United Methodist Church and urban renewal and the birth of El Pueblo de Los Angeles historical monument. And she may also talk a little bit about the Spanish American Institute, which was in Gardena. And so, Amalia, we're very glad to have you here. Thank you for doing this on a Saturday, and go for it.
All right, thank you, Greg. Thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to sort of talk about, merge some of the research that you mentioned on the historical landmarks in the center of downtown LA, and talk a little bit about how they're actually connected to Gardina's Spanish American Institute Industrial Training for Boys. In doing that, I'm going to shed light on one of the collections that we actually have in our repository, which is of the Spanish American Institute. And the Huntington Library actually holds the entire collection of the Institute's records when it was officially moved from its original site in 1971. So there's certainly a body of scholarship on industrial and boarding schools in the progressive era, the period between 1897 and 1916. But this specific LA institution is an often understudied industrial training school that was located in the South Bay in Gardena. And this presentation will discuss how this boarding school has a very direct relationship and link to the Methodist Church located in the El Pueblo Historical Monument, right, in downtown LA, which is near the more famous Olvera Street that we all probably know about. So ultimately, I will discuss the historical implications of the SAI, the institution's role in Americanization and evangelization programs in early Los Angeles that were bound by the period's assumptions about Mexicans and Mexican culture, and LA, early LA's professed, and we can argue LA's ongoing quote unquote Mexican problem. So the Spanish American Institute was a Methodist operated boarding school. So it was established by the Southern California Conference of the Methodist Church, and it was moved to Gardena in 1913, and it sat on 30 acres of land east of Figueroa and north of Alondra. So the Institute itself was designed as a program for young boys ages 12 through 18. It provided grammar and vocational education, and the two main trades were agriculture and printing. But the founding of the school in Gardena has its roots in the heart of Los Angeles, and I'll go ahead and explain a little bit about how and why. So pictured here is Sonora Town, and that's a small enclave north of downtown, was a small enclave north of downtown LA's historic core. And it was primarily populated by Mexican and Italian immigrants. And of course, the Mexican people that were there prior to California statehood, AKA the people who were crossed by the border, not the people who crossed the border. So this area was despised by the elite class for, they felt it duplicated the low life of Mexico. And of course, Sonora Town was quickly transformed at the turn of the century, right? Agriculture and the railroad industry drew a large number of immigrants beginning in the 1870s. So especially a large wave of immigrants, refugees, right, after escaping the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1920. So the influx of Mexican immigrants intensified fear and disdain in what was, the all-white destiny of California, right? So ethnic neighborhoods were thereby demonized as slums and were considered a direct threat to peace and order. So a quick recap of the Methodists coming to Los Angeles right after the Civil War. The Methodist Board of Home Missions resent Adam Bland after a previous attempt to come to California when it was sparsely populated. So after the Civil War, they resent him to establish the Methodist Church in LA. And of course, the railroad facilitated travel to Southern California. So there were land booms and, the railroad spurred growth. And so it drew a new wave of membership in Protestant denominations. So by the 1870s, of course, there was an increase in white migration and, established a growing Methodist Protestant presence in Los Angeles. Catholicism in Southern California was not as dominant as some whites may have perceived because some of the Catholics of Spanish and Mexican heritage many weren't actively involved religiously. So with the growing Protestant presence, leaders of the Methodist Church requested the creation of Southern California Conference. So By 1879, ministers discussed the possibility of starting a mission to serve the Spanish-speaking people of the region, Spanish-speaking and Portuguese people, speaking people of the region. And in 1911, Vernon McComb was appointed by the Methodist Church to direct what was then called Spanish work. So, but the approach to Spanish work was, of course, inevitably bound by the period's pseudo-scientific racial explanations of cultural differences and the rise of the eugenics movement in the United States. So the Methodist evangelization work reflected the progressive movement's, problematic views on race, where they believed Mexicans could be saved so long as they assimilated to American culture. They believed it was their duty to help educate and assimilate, and took on the burden of Americanization, quote unquote. And the language here reflects some of those sentiments, drawn directly from a book written by leader Vernon McCombs. He talks about, the deficiencies of Mexicans, how Americans can help them rise higher, and talks about the sorrows and social ills that could be fixed. So then what is the connection between Gardina's Spanish American Institute and the downtown Methodist Church? Well, it was the same leaders that led the SAI, the Spanish American Institute, that spearheaded the construction of the Plaza Methodist Church that currently resides in what we know as El Pueblo Historical Monument, aka Olvera Street. Pictured here is the quarterly periodical published by SAI, and that was produced in the printing shop where the immigrant boys and Mexican boys worked. So the Plaza Church was pitched by the Methodist leaders as a way to Americanize and civilize and quote unquote clean up the area and civilize its people. So a church on the plaza would help quote unquote clean up and morally uplift what were presumed to be backwards populations. So again, driven by the era's scientific thinking, white housing and public health officials characterized Mexicans as dirty, unhygienic, and disease-ridden. Conditions were attributed to their beliefs and their customs rather than poverty, lack of aid or resources. So they were, Mexicans were therefore considered, unable to adjust to modern industrial society. Hence the need for an institute like SAI in Gardena. So the flyer here on the left provides evidence of some of that language that was used by the Plaza Community Center, also part of the Methodist Church, adjacent to Olvera Street, to what we know now as Olvera Street. So they believe they were equipped to save these populations of quote unquote low standards of morals and low type of amusements. So it was the young boys whose families live near the plaza in Sonora town, many who attended the Plaza Methodist Church and were then recruited for the Spanish American Institute. So bound by the era's notions of race, the Institute's professional mission was to, again, save Mexicans. They were to be made into useful citizens and to be rid of their vices. And so this historical context reveals how SAI was part of a wave of industrial training programs created by employers and reformers to acculturate and train immigrant males for manual labor. So California had developed Americanization programs with the help of academics, social workers, government officials, and they aimed to essentially, quote unquote, sanitize and eradicate ethnicity and foster the American habits of thrift and industry. So Americanizing Mexican children was aligned with the moral belief of the Protestant leaders and the business interest of financial leaders and the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. So because Catholicism was associated with paganism, backwardness, laziness, white Christian values were considered the road to salvation. Methodist leaders assured that Mexicans' backwardness was not due to a lack of native ability, but instead of lack of proper conditions necessary to produce the right type of leadership. So they believed that the congregation's success depended on securing a manufactory of leaders. They were certain that the Spanish American Institute would in due time, in due season, return rich dividends for, I quote, the good men and glory of God. So some of the SAI's programs involved agriculture. So the boys maintain a 10-acre farm, and the boys were said to, quote, feel the call of the wild soon after their recent arrival from Mexico, but they quickly took up the routine and work duties of the Institute, responsibilities and the lessons that the Mexicans needed to learn. So what is this history laid bare? And really a need to recharacterize the collection of SAI as more than mere institutional history of an ordinary boarding school in Gardena. The collection must be reframed within the political and historical reality that was the progressive era, and whose legacy we still see today, the way that Mexican Americans are racialized in Los Angeles, and also just the militarization of the police and subsequent criminalization of youth of color in this very period. In some of his writings, McCombs is quoted as saying that 70 to 80% of the crimes in Los Angeles were committed by Mexicans in early LA. And furthermore, the collection scope and content must emphasize the parallels between the industrial school and the Methodist leaders' role in harmful and white supremacist Americanization programs, whose legacies we see in early Mexican American education and on to, post-World War II Black and Brown education in Los Angeles. So that is a glimpse of that research. Thank you.
Thank you, Amalia. Does anybody have any questions for Amalia? So
Amalia, after doing your research and everything, what did you think about what was going on at that time?
Like initial gut reactions, I have a lot of thoughts.
Yes, I'm just curious. Yes, initial gut reaction.
I think for me personally, I think the first thing that again, I was a product of South LA schools, and I think what it led me to understand is like a lot of the roots of a lot of the vocational education, right? Even my cousins attended Linwood schools in the 80s. I attended Linwood schools in the 90s, and even seeing even just a generation apart, how they were solely tracked vocationally, and how by the time I was in school, I think many of our returning alum were now, tracking us into the college route. So I think I started to dig a little deeper into how a lot of the vocational training in a lot of LAUSD schools was really rooted in the decisions made by industrial leaders in the early period, and sort of racialized notions about the fact that Mexicans were good with their hands and we're not intellectuals, right? So shouldn't bother teaching them liberal arts, and how it's like it's very, very historically rooted. And the primary sources reveal that quite openly, right? When we really dig into the historical records. So I think those were my initial sort of reactions.
Did you see, so you saw a connection between that time and when you were going through school?
Absolutely. And even the way that Mexicans are continue to be racialized today, right? It's like we're not that far from the progressive era, as we'd like to think. So I think I really, really got into understanding and fascinated by really understanding the roots of some of that rhetoric and thinking, and even some of the language that I remember from the 90s as a kid. So
thank you.
And
oh, sorry. I'm sure you know William Estrada very well, his book on the Plaza. Did you count on him in any regard or interview him for his
No,
wonderful background on the plaza. It's very extensive. That book is highly recommended.
yeah, I did. I've never actually met him and I didn't get to interview him, but I did use his book extensively because I was really shocked when doing this research on the body of scholarship, specifically on the plaza and the monuments. I mean, there's a lot written on, early LA and early California history, but I think I was shocked to see that there was little to no work specifically on the work of that church. And I think a lot of the research that I did was specifically on the records of the Plaza Methodist Church, and that's how I found out about the Spanish American Institute and then the Plaza Community Center, both which still exist and have like very, obviously problematic racist histories.
Yeah, it's always surprised me to see the Methodist Church there, because I always assumed it was Catholic, because you have the other Catholic church there, much older on the west side. But then, the Mexican Council was there for many, many decades until it moved to its present location. And now you have a gallery working in the area. So I'm just seeing all these different uses of that building. And I've always questioned, well, when did the Mexican Consulate start their operations there? Did you have any background on that?
You know what? I don't remember the exact date, but when I was doing my research, basically when they turned it into a historical monument in the 40s and 50s, so those, some of the historic preservation and some clearance movements, that's when they closed the Plaza Community Center, which was right next to the church that also worked alongside the Methodists. And that's when the building, I think, was turned into something else for the city. So that the what you're referring to, I think, may have come for sure after the 70s, because that's when the Methodist Church no longer occupied it for its community center, which provided like all sorts of community services. They moved the building elsewhere. But yeah, going back to your comment too about, and that's what's interesting too, because I started this research because I started interning there in 2015 when I was a grad student, and a lot of people, when they came by, they always thought it was the Catholic Church, right? Vera Street, that a lot of Mexicans know about. I think that like growing up, that's where everyone went to baptize their kid, right? That was like the church that we all knew about. So I myself didn't know there was a Methodist church there either. And I think that's when I grew interested in this research, is that I learned that it was historically a Mexican-American church. And I said, oh, wow, like Mexican-American Protestants were here that early, and started digging deeper into the history and realized that partially what was happening, right, not sort of an expert in that area, but when, the Mexicans were coming into the region after the revolution, the Catholics weren't doing a whole lot of recruiting work, right? Because and there were many reasons for that. One of many was that the Irish priests were racist, right? And also the Catholic Church wasn't doing some sort of overt recruiting work. And when I looked at some of the records, some of their arguments is like we're not going to do charity work. And the Protestant missionaries were quite overtly doing quote unquote recruiting work, right? Goodwill Industries was actually founded in that Methodist church, and it was doing the training for the women and Americanizing the women and teaching them how to eat like Americans and how to work like Americans. And the Spanish American Institute was taking care of the boys, right? By teaching them the trade and teaching them to be good docile industrial workers.
Did you see parallels between like the schools that they sent the First Nations kids to, and maybe even the Freeman schools after slavery? Did you see parallels between that, looking to assimilate, but at the same time taking that cultural, removing your culture, but replacing it with an anglicized culture?
Oh, absolutely. And I think recently too, now that we're all reading about a lot of the Indian boarding, like the Native American boarding schools, and somehow that history coming to light. And I'm really fascinated by that and digging a little deeper and sort of seeing some of those parallels. I think I'm scheduled to go to the Huntington to actually look at the records of the SAI, because those have the files of each child, and I'm really curious to see what those records will reveal, or what even is available. Some of them are actually closed off, so because they have the 75-year period, so some of them I can't even see. But I'm really curious to see what those first-hand accounts look like, because I think presumably on the surface, it's like, oh, it's a vocational school to teach grammars, but it's like, let's look a little deeper, and what are some of the parallels between some of these, what is some of the violence and the damage, right? What are some of these connections? But yes, that it spurred another idea for another potential research project. And I can't say too much about it because I don't know deeply about that sort of area of research. But I think that, there has to have been real violence and harm in the process of essentially, forcibly removing your culture and urging you to adapt another one. One thing I will say too is that in his research, George Sanchez, because I think his family belonged to the migrants of that period. One thing he does say in his research, in his book, Becoming Mexican American, which is like very well known, very popular, acclaimed book, is that what was happening too is that a lot of the Mexican migrants who were Catholic were practicing Protestantism and working with the Methodists and secretly doing Catholicism at home, right? And they were doing it because the Methodists were providing jobs and were providing support, and it was sort of the community. But in his research, he sort of talks a little bit about that phenomenon, which I was really fascinated by too.
Oh yeah, they're linked to that. But do you see a link between that industrial school and say like the development of reform schools?
Oh yeah, and that's another area that I feel like that's another area of research that I started digging really deep into, because what was happening at the time, as I mentioned, it's like suddenly you have this influx of new migrants, and then of course that's also coincides with the professionalization of the LAPD in Los Angeles. It's like suddenly we have all these people of color, and we have to find a way to control them, right? So at the same time, that's when you see a rise in the criminalization of Black and brown youth. The crime statistics, I think also McComb says in one piece in the LA Times that, these immigrants are responsible for over half the crime, and the Mexican boys are responsible for 75% of the crime. So of course, what does that say about who was targeted, who was criminalized, what counted as a crime? And I think that there is, a definite connection between the history of juvenile delinquency and these industrial reform schools and the Protestant evangelization movement in early LA.
Okay, I'm definitely going to get in touch with you because I'd like you to do a presentation to talk for Color Compton, but we'll talk about that.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Amalia. And Amalia is a member of the archives department, and so you can contact her through the department anytime you'd like. Okay, well, now it's time. Alison, are you here and ready? You are, good.
Right.
We're ready for our keynote speaker, Alison Bruesehoff. She brings 2 decades of museum experience to her position as executive director of the Rancho Los Cerritos historic site. Her last directorship was at the Dominguez Rancho Adobe, where as executive director, she really transformed the place and she oversaw all the operations. She obtained her MS in Museum Studies from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and began her employment with museums at the Smithsonian. She also received an MBA with an emphasis in organizational leadership from Woodbury University in Southern California. That would come in handy for running a museum house. In addition, during college, she studied at the University of Cambridge and Oxford, where the museums and collections are world-renowned. Alison is now leading the charge in opening the doors to the next phase of the Rancho Los Cerritos master plan. I've been a on the board or on a committee of the Long Beach Navy Trust, which is a funding organization in Long Beach for certain architectural and historical entities. And we've often funded the Rancho through Alison's leadership. And I remember some good interviews and times for Alison coming over from when she was working at the Rancho Dominguez and coming to the archives and looking at stuff there. But all right, take it away, Alison.
All right, thank you, Greg. Thanks everyone for having me. This is a tough group to follow, but I'll give it a shot. So many excellent speakers and so much to learn. So what I want to cover today is brief history of Rancho Los Cerritos. It's not a deep dive, it is brief. Also to talk a little bit about the importance of landmarks and how that all relates to this group. So you go to the next slide. So Rancho Los Cerritos is a local, state, and national landmark located in the Bixby Knolls area of Long Beach. It is one of 2 ranchos in Long Beach and one of many ranchos in LA County, including the Dominguez Rancho Adobe Museum, located on the Alameda Corridor. And to Ms. Deb's point earlier, there are 1,200 monuments in LA that are considered historic cultural monuments. There are 583 properties that are named National and Historic, and there are 21 National Historic Landmarks in LA County. Quite a bit. It is definitely not enough, but there is work, as Ms. Deb said, going on around that whole endeavor. In the next slide, this is what the Rancho looks like today in 2021. Next slide, please. One thing I wanted to point out with this presentation is that the history of Long Beach, the South Bay, California, did not start with the European settlement, nor the westward expansion, nor the establishment of the mission system. For hundreds of years, there have been indigenous people living in this area, and there was already a rich California history. I believe we need to recognize that and to understand that the history of California is indeed very rich and very deep. Next slide. So in 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo explored the California coast and claimed the land for Spain. However, Spanish settlement did not begin until 1769, almost 200 years later. The first settlers to arrive were a mix of soldiers who were in charge of setting up presidios, forts, and the missions. And of course, charged with turning the area's inhabitants to loyal Spanish subjects. Next slide. The first 3 land grants given to individual Spanish citizens were given to 3 retired soldiers. The largest of these was ceded to Manuel Nieto in 1784 and was approximately 300,000 acres. When Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1822, Alta California became part of Mexico. Nieto's land was divided among his children upon his death in 1834, and his daughter Manuela received Rancho Los Cerritos, which you see in the green, and it was called the Ranch of the Little Hills. Next slide. We skip ahead in history to about 1830, when John Temple, who is originally from Massachusetts, who you see it on the left, came to Los Angeles in 1830. He was baptized a Roman Catholic and was thus eligible to become a Mexican citizen. In 1830, he married Rafaela Cota, who was the daughter of an important Santa Barbara family. Their only child, a daughter named Francisca, was born the next year. Temple was a true entrepreneur and was involved in a variety of enterprises, including a mercantile shop in Los Angeles and a warehouse at the port of San Pedro. Next slide. In late 1843, Temple bought Rancho Los Cerritos from some of Nieto's descendants to run his own cattle ranch, hence part of his entrepreneurship. And the house that we call the historic adobe house was finished in 1844. Temple also planted an elaborate garden, probably one of the fanciest in Southern California at the time, when it was enclosed by a 10 or 12-foot high redwood fence. And in fact, some of Temple's trees are still standing today. One of the things he did when he moved into the house was he planted 3 tall cypresses, 2 of which we still have on site. And believe it or not, but at the time when he planted those, you could see those 3 cypresses all the way from the ocean. The area is so built up now, you can't see them from the street outside the house. But they are still there, and they are considered 2 of the most historic cypresses in the Southern California area. Next slide. He had up to 15,000 head of cattle that roamed freely over the land. And to control and identify them, each of the ranchos, including Cerritos and Dominguez, held an annual roundup. Here, calves were branded and strays were sent back to their home ranchos. Many cattle were selected for slaughter at this time, and their hides dried in the sun. The cow hides were destined for factories in New England to be made into shoes, saddles, belts, and clothing. The tallow, otherwise known as cow fat, was used for making soap and candles. And during the gold rush, Temple profited by driving cattle north to feed hungry miners, while also selling their hides and their tallow. All of the cattle did receive their own brand, and there are historic stories between Temple and some of the Dominguez descendants and ancestors as to whose cattle were which. And the borders were pretty nebulous and a little bit free, so there's a lot of cattle that roamed back and forth between the ranchos. Next slide. Beginning in December of 1861, weeks of torrential rain drenched California, causing floods which drowned many cattle. This was then followed by 2 years of severe drought, which frankly devastated the cattle industry in the southern cow counties. Most of Temple's herds starved during this time. And at this point in 1866, John Temple, nearly 70 years old, retired from business and sold Rancho Los Cerritos to Flint, Bixby and Company for $20,000 or 75 cents per acre. Next slide. The first Bixby family members came to California from Maine during the gold rush. After mining and operating a butcher shop in gold country, Llewellyn Bixby and his cousins, Benjamin and Thomas Flint, purchased a sheep ranch called Rancho San Justo near modern-day San Juan Bautista. Brother Joseph Bixby was chosen to oversee the new Rancho Los Cerritos operation. His wife, Margaret, who was sister to Llewellyn Bixby's wife, Mary, moved to the ranch with him. At this point, the ranch was into sheep ranching. It was more profitable than cattle ranching. And Joseph did so well, and wool prices were so high that he bought half interest in the rancho 3 years later, and then soon registered his own brand. He improved wool quality and quantity by bringing in Spanish merino rams for breeding purposes. Soon he had over 30,000 head of sheep on the 27,000 acre ranch. Next slide. The sheep were separated into bands of about 2,000 sheep, each overseen by a herder and his dogs. Most of the herders you see in these photos were Basques from northern Spain or southern France. Twice a year, the sheep were brought to the ranch barn area to be sheared for their wool. 40 to 50 sheep herders, mostly of Mexican and indigenous descent, spent 6 weeks at the Rancho, sleeping in barns at night and clipping wool during the day. They received about a nickel per fleece. Next slide. The Bixby's prosperity allowed them to improve the old adobe with a pitched shingled roof, new whitewash, and wallpaper, as we see in the photo today. Next slide. This is the internal courtyard at the house circa 1872. This is where most of the work was done. What you would see now when you came to the Rancho is the restored work wing and the north wing. Of course, it doesn't look anything like this now, but this gives you a sense of what the ranch looked like in 1872. Next slide. The Bixbys moved out of the Rancho into the new town of Long Beach, which was developed on Rancho Los Cerritos land in the 1880s. At this point, for the next several decades, more of the Rancho property was sold to become farms and dairies for the growing city of Long Beach. The Rancho was divided into areas and rented out to the tenants who worked on these farms or at the adjacent Virginia Country Club. This is a fascinating period in the Rancho's history that we don't talk a lot about, are beginning to talk about now. And in fact, we're thankful to LA as subject, who helped digitize some of the oral histories of this period. So now we can hear firsthand from some of the family descendants that lived there, what their experiences were like at the Rancho during this period. Many of them did work on the farms in the area and also at Virginia Country Club. And to this day, some of the family descendants still visit the Rancho and share their history and also some of the objects from their history, which is absolutely fascinating. In fact, our next exhibit, which opens in March of 2022, will feature this period and share the stories of the people that lived on the Rancho and helped create the city of Long Beach. And then next slide. Then, if you remember Jotham Bixby from a few slides back, his nephew Llewellyn acquired the property in 1930 and remodeled the house extensively. In addition to a new roof, modern utilities, and sun porch, the gardens were newly landscaped. And the slide you see here is that inner courtyard that we saw a couple of slides back, where everyone was working in the inner courtyard. This is what it looked like during the remodel. Next slide. In the 1930s, this is that same inner courtyard, quite a transformation from the 1800s into the 1930s. Next slide. And this is what it looks like today in 2021, even more of a transformation. And the next slide, we're compare and contrast. This is what the courtyard looked like in the 1930s. And then the next slide is what it looks like today. The next slide. This is what the house in the background looked like in the backyard, excuse me, in the 1930s. And this is what it looks like today. And the tree you see in this photo on the right is our Moreton Bay fig. It is one of the oldest trees on the site and is considered a historic tree. The story behind the tree was planted in the late 1880s. It was 2 Moreton Bay figs, but they were planted too close together. So they grew into each other and became the Morton Bay fig that you see now. It's one of the most historic trees in the area of Long Beach. There are over, for those that are nature buffs, we have over 330 trees on site, not different species, but 330 trees, over 1,000 different type of plants and flowers, California native garden, this backyard, an arroyo that represents the original watershed in the area, as well as our California native garden, and an orchard that we do make our jams and marmalades from. Quite the active site, even after all of its history. And the next slide. Then, in 1955, the family descendants had moved out of the house yet again. And both the family and the community, recognizing the historic importance of Rancho Los Cerritos, the site became a museum owned by the city of Long Beach. Today, the Rancho is a national, state, and local historic landmark, and it tells the story of early settlement and the creation of so many cities from the pastures where cattle and sheep once roamed. The Rancho was run by the city of Long Beach, the library department, and as such, we do have a California research library on site. It is the only California research library in the Long Beach public library system. People are able to come and use the books and do research. They unfortunately cannot check them out, but it is an absolutely fantastic resource. The museum was then run by the Parks and Rec Department of the city of Long Beach. And in 2012, a partnership was brokered with the city of Long Beach, and the Rancho Los Cerritos Foundation took over the management of the Rancho. It is owned by the city of Long Beach, and we have a great relationship with the city. However, it is the Rancho Los Cerritos Foundation that runs the daily operations of the site. Next slide. Today, the Rancho offers many diverse and exciting options for Long Beach residents, other city residents, and visitors alike. Volunteer docents lead public tours of the house and the garden, as well as specialized field trips for fourth grade students. We have an award-winning educational outreach program, Long Ago Long Beach, that pre-COVID took the Rancho to after-school programs at schools across the city. We also offered, and will start to offer again, a wide range of public programs from intimate art workshops to large-scale family festivals. And of course, it's also a beautiful site, right, for weddings, baby showers, birthday parties, corporate luncheons, and more. There is something for everyone at Rancho Los Cerritos. And one thing I'd like to point out at this point is with the Rancho is, despite COVID, we have been fortunate to have been open since June of 2020. Our gardens were considered an essential space for mental health and well-being. So our gardens have been continuously open since then. And we have heard so many wonderful comments about what a safe, serene space it is to visit, to just take a breath in today's crazy times. And we're very fortunate that we have been an area of service for all of our communities. Next slide. In 2019, the Rancho celebrated its 175th anniversary, otherwise known as a semi-set centennial. You can say that 3 times fast, in a variety of ways throughout the year. What this year also did for us, though, is gave us a moment of pause. The house has been there for 175 years. We have shared 175 years of history, but it isn't the full history of what is at the Rancho. So with that, we took a short pause and created the Opening Doors campaign. And the next slide. With this campaign, the site is ever changing and we're always looking toward the future as we celebrate our past. Through the Opening Doors campaign, we have revitalized our master plan, created a new strategic plan, and are embracing more stories of everyone that worked and lived at the Rancho that we need to tell. We recognize we tell a singular story of the Temple and the Bixby families, and we need to expand that story to talk about everyone that contributed to the development of the Rancho, Long Beach, the South Bay, in Southern California, and we have begun that work. One of the reasons we did that is when we talk about landmarks, to Robert's point earlier, sometimes when we don't have landmarks, we don't tell all the stories. Even when we do have landmarks, though, there is a tendency to only tell a part of the story. And we recognize that, and we understand that we need to tell the full story of everyone that was at the Rancho. And that is the importance of landmarks with this, is understanding who was there, what they contributed, and how that all plays together. We also need to tell the stories of other cities, and that's how this Rancho is beginning to connect with the different cities in our area. There is a shared history between Long Beach, Compton, Dominguez, Carson, that we are beginning to explore, since at one point, all the people that lived in the area traveled throughout the site and the local area. And with that is the end of my formal presentation. I think, any questions?
Thank you, Alison. Anybody with any questions?
I have one. Manuel Nieto, didn't he own that land grant originally?
Manuel Nieto? Yes.
Mm-hmm. And was he African descent?
I don't know for a fact. There is some indication that he was of mixed descent, but I don't know that for a fact.
Okay.
I could just chime in on that for a second.
Yeah,
Go
please.
ahead, Robert.
Yeah, Manu Nieto, came up from Sinaloa, which was a basically an African community. So, along with the Pico family and some others, Manu Nieto was definitely of African descent.
Okay.
Anyway, I loved your presentation, and I'm just to reiterate, I wanted to ask you about the gardens.
Yes.
Because I know, like, during the Depression, I guess the house had been abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And were the gardens devastated and they had to like rebuild it and put new ones in?
To some extent, yes. It was during the tenant period, and the backyard was used really primarily for dry farming by the tenants that lived on the Rancho. And when Llewellyn Bixby Jr. renovated the house in the 1930s, he brought in a landscape architect, William Cornell, to design the gardens that you see now. So they didn't mimic exactly Temple's design, but it incorporated a lot of Temple's design in the trees that he had and created the garden that we now have.
Oh, great. But so during the Depression, were I guess renters, or were just people just squatting in there?
No, they were renters. They were people that worked on the farms, and some of them worked at the Virginia Country Club.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Alison, great presentation. My question is you mentioned John Temple, who that's where the Bixby's got the property from,
Mm-hmm.
the Temples. Is there any connection, as you know, of the street Temple? We have a Temple Street in Compton. Actually, the oldest church in Compton sits on that street, on that corner of the Methodist, first Methodist church. is
Mhm.
there. And then there's, I grew up, even though I've been in Compton for over 40 years, I actually grew up in LA. And my parents had moved from South Central back in the 50s to the Echo Park area. And over there, close to downtown, where the Adobe, where the Alvera Street is,
Mhm.
there's a street all the way downtown. You go downtown, you know, a street called Temple Street, right? Downtown Temple. It runs all the way through near Beverly Hills, actually. And Temple is, so that in the neighborhood I lived in, close to Belmont High School, which was the only high school in that area for many, many years, built back in the 1920s. I attended that school and graduated and was there in the 60s and graduated in 71. So that section of that community we call Temple. So the neighborhood I grew up in back in LA, we call Temple. Is there any connection between that family and that street, and also the temples, churches that are around the country? Do you know of?
The churches around the country, I don't think so. The street wouldn't surprise me, but I bet Robert probably has more information on that than I do, because he is the amazing historian.
No, I've just been driving up and down these streets a lot. That's all, Allison.
But it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, Sepulveda Boulevard is named after the Sepulveda family, so it wouldn't surprise me at all. And I'd have to ask our on-site historian if that is the case. I don't want to say it is and be wrong, but it wouldn't be far-fetched, but I don't know.
Okay.
I'll just put my 2 cents in. And Allison, keep in mind that I got a lot of this information right in that library.
I know. That's what I'm saying. You're the historian, Robert. You're going to know more than I am.
Well, you guys have the Bancroft collection. I mean, that is just so rare and it's so accessible, you know. But you know, Gibson Temple was the investor for that sold the 4,800 acres that led to the creation of the city of Compton. So he was an investor. And I believe he was a supervisor also, a county supervisor at one time. So I wouldn't be surprised if Temple is named after him, because of course the supervisors were downtown. But yeah, must be a link.
I would think so.
Are there any other questions? Any other questions on any of our speakers today?
I would like to ask Alison, when is the next event that you're having at the Adobe?
December 12th and December 19th. We're doing after-hour candlelight tours, which should be fun. It's our first program in a year and a half. So looking forward to that, and hopefully we'll have more programs next year. We all know it's an ever-changing environment, but we are excited that we get to move to doing some in-person programs starting December 12th.
And is the Adobe for rent for special occasions, anything like that?
It is, yes. Yes, we do quite a bit of site use. That slowed down in the past year and a half, but we accommodated that, and we are now busier than ever, especially with weddings. Everyone that couldn't get married in 2020 is now getting married. So that's exciting. But yes, it is available for use. It's on our website, and we're always excited to have groups. We also do rent out the space for free for different community groups to use the space. If someone wants to have a meeting outside on the grounds right now, we do that as well. We've had the Long Beach Women's Shelter use the space, as well as New Hope Grief Counseling. We've had some schools have outdoor classes. So we're trying to do what we can to be an area of service for the community.
And what times are you open? Because I'm just going to tell people they should really go check out the gardens, especially, you know, if you guys are open on Sunday afternoon, that'd be great.
Yes, we're open Wednesday through Sunday, 1 to 5, and on Saturdays we're open from 10 to 5.
Yeah, I mean, trust me, you guys, it's a treat. It's a treat.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
And
Melissa.
actually on Robert's note, I would also like to add that on the site of the Plaza Methodist Church in downtown Los Angeles is the is the Museum of Social Justice, and we currently have an exhibition. I'll put the link in the chat box. So this exhibit is called Caravanas del Diablo, and it documents the work of photographer Ada Trillo, who documented firsthand the migrant caravan, the contentious migrant caravan that we all remember about during the Trump administration. And she just documents the human experience and the historical context behind the violence in Honduras, El Salvador, and Central America. So if you are, during the break, if you find yourself in downtown, I encourage you to visit the museum. It's in the basement of the Plaza Methodist Church, right next to the alley going into Olvera Street. And of course, it's a very tiny museum, but then right across you have the Chinese American Museum, the Italian American Museum. So, and then of course the Plaza, the Mexican American Museum. So there's plenty to see, and I really encourage you all to check out this really moving and powerful exhibit.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody who has spoken and who's stayed with us today. Thank you so much. I hope next year that we'll have the Symposium of the South Bay History People in a live place, hopefully on the 5th floor of the archives. And on behalf of the Gerth Archives, thank you very much for attending today. And Tony, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for your great presence here today. You could have been any place else in the world, well, virtually really, but you chose to be with us. And I know I enjoyed all the speakers. I learned a lot. I learned something every time I listen to this type of knowledge. And I want to thank you on behalf of our president, Reverend Charles Brown of the Compton Historical Society. We thank you for your participation today. All of our board members who are present, we thank you. All our supporters. Please do visit us at Compton Historical Society on Facebook at 125 Project. That is our Facebook ID, 125 Project. Also, our Twitter feed is 125 Compton, 125 Compton. Also, we want to thank and shout out to our partnership with Dominguez Hills through the Gerth Archives Special Collections Department, who Greg Williams is the director there. We want to thank our partnership with him. And I know that on the screen, it shows Compton 125 Historical Society, and that is Jared Collins, who is he's one of our board members also. We want to thank Jared for being our official Zoom person today. He is our Zoom official, we call him. But he does a lot of other great things. I worked at Cal State Dominguez Hills also, and we want to thank him for his work today. But all of our Facebook listeners who were viewed today, we want to thank you. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us at the Compton Historical Society. And I want to turn it back over to Greg to give us an ending. Thank you, Greg.
Yes, thank you to Gerard for being the Zoom guru. He's no longer with the Gerth Archives. He now works for the Academy Museum downtown, or wherever it is. And but he left us with a good deal of important digitized primary resources, including the material that Alison talked about, some of the tough stuff that the LAS Subject Grant helped us do. So without that, Robert, of course, thank you to everybody, Karini, Pam, Amalia, Debbie, Alison, Tony, Ricardo, whoever else has helped us with this. We're going to call you on you again. So thanks so much and good afternoon.